Echoes in Dallas, The Unspoken Verdict. Chapter 1. The Weight of November. The world moves fast, but history has a way of freezing in place. If you close your eyes and let the noise of the modern world fade, you can still hear the distant chime of a bell in late November, 1963. It was a Friday in Dallas, Texas. The sun was unexpectedly warm for late autumn, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete and manicured lawns of Dealey Plaza. A black 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible turned slowly off Houston Street, making that sharp, fateful 80-degree left turn onto Elm Street. Inside, a young, vibrant president smiled, waving at a dense crowd that seemed to embody the ultimate optimism of a new American era. Nellie Connolly, the wife of the Texas governor, turned to him in the jump seat and said, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Kennedy smiled, adjusted his jacket, and replied with his very last words, "No, you certainly can't." At that exact microsecond, the presidential limousine passed the shadow of the Texas School Book Depository. But beneath those cheers and the fluttering American flags, something else was moving. A cold, silent, subterranean current. A calculated alignment of hidden forces that had already decided this specific day would be his last on Earth. When the shots rang out at 12:30 p.m., echoing like firecrackers against the concrete structures of the plaza, time did not just slow down. It fractured permanently. In a matter of seconds, 3 high-velocity bullets altered the entire trajectory of the modern Western world. We are told by the official record that a lone, troubled young man with a $12 Italian Mannlicher Carcano rifle did this all by himself from a cramped 6th-floor window. We are told that history is simple, that tragedies are just chaotic coincidences born from individual madness. But the human mind naturally resists simplicity when the stakes are this high. If you look closely at the physical geography of Dealey Plaza, the logistics of a single shooter become a mathematical absurdity. The trajectory of the magic bullet, the pristine condition in which it was found on a stretcher at Parkland Hospital, the immediate sealing of the crime scene, all of it points away from chaos and toward meticulous design. Tonight, we are not looking for a solitary shooter on a grassy knoll or a frantic Marxist in a Texas theater. We are looking for the architects, the ones who drew the blueprints, the ones who cleared the security paths, and the ones who stood to lose absolutely everything if John F. Kennedy lived to see the dawn of 1964. Breathe in slowly. Let the tension of the day fade into the background. Let us step together into the labyrinth of the century. Chapter 2. The Loneliness of the Lone Wolf. To understand the shadow cast over Dallas, we must first look at the light they chose to throw upon the wall. Lee Harvey Oswald. The official narrative painted him as a ghost, an isolated, deeply disturbed Marxist defector who suddenly packed his bags for the Soviet Union, worked in a radio factory in Minsk, married Marina Prusakova, the niece of a Soviet internal security officer, and then just decided to come home. He slipped through the tightest security nets of the Cold War intelligence apparatus without ringing a single alarm bell in Washington. It is a compelling story for a spy novel, but a deeply strange one for reality. Consider the documented facts as you drift closer to sleep. A former U.S. Marine who held a higher-than-average security clearance at the Atsugi Air Base in Japan, a base used exclusively for top-secret U-2 spy plane missions, leaves the military at the absolute height of the Red Scare. He offers to hand over American radar secrets to the Soviet enemy. Yet, when he decides to return to the United States in 1962, the U.S. State Department doesn't arrest him for treason. Instead, they simply welcome him back with open arms, hand him his passport, and the government even loans him several $100s to fund his travel back to Texas. Upon his arrival in Dallas and Fort Worth, he is immediately taken under the wing of George de Mohrenschildt, a wealthy, aristocratic Russian émigré who, as records would later reveal, was a trusted asset of the CIA's Domestic Contact Division. By the summer of 1963, Oswald moves to New Orleans and sets up a one-man branch of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. But look closely at the address stamped on his propaganda flyers: 544 Camp Street. This exact same building, with an entrance just around the corner on Lafayette Street, housed the private investigative office of Guy Bannister, a fiercely anti-communist, former high-ranking FBI agent and Office of Naval Intelligence veteran who was actively helping CIA-backed anti-Castro militants train for a violent invasion of the island under Operation Mongoose. Two completely opposing ideological universes, sharing the exact same physical space, the same corridors, the same air. Oswald was seen in the company of David Ferry, a pilot working for Bannister and anti-Castro operations. The deeper you look into Oswald's movements, the less he looks like an isolated loner, and the more he resembles a blank canvas. He was a figure painted over by multiple hands, an intelligence asset moving under a deeply fabricated cover, designed to be whatever the directors needed him to be when the final curtain fell. He was a man caught in a web so vast, he didn't even see the individual strands until they tightened around his neck in that dark Dallas police basement. "I'm just a patsy," he yelled to the flashing cameras, his eyes wide with the sudden, terrifying realization of his true role. A phrase that still echoes in the quiet corners of history. Chapter 3: The Men in the Fog. When the Warren Commission closed its books in the autumn of 1964, it drew a neat, tidy circle around Dealey Plaza. Case closed, the public was told. The American system was intact. But circles have a way of breaking when you look at them under a colder, more clinical light. For decades, independent researchers and legal minds have pointed toward the most obvious, visible domestic suspects. They look at the Central Intelligence Agency, bitter over the catastrophic Bay of Pigs fiasco in 1961. They recall how Kennedy had fired their legendary, long-serving director, Allen Dulles, along with Deputy Director Charles Cabell, and how JFK had famously whispered to his closest aides that he wanted to tear the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Then there was the American Mafia. Powerful mob bosses like Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, Santo Trafficante Jr. in Florida, and Sam Giancana in Chicago were furious. They had quietly used their union muscle and clandestine funds to help secure JFK the razor-thin 1960 election victory, believing they would gain a sympathetic ear in Washington and regain access to their lucrative Los Casinos in Havana. Instead, John F. Kennedy appointed his fierce younger brother, Robert, as Attorney General. Robert Kennedy launched the most aggressive, relentless legal assault on organized crime in American history, dragging mob bosses before grand juries and threatening to dismantle their empires permanently. And beyond the mob stood the heavy machinery of the military-industrial complex, watching with growing dread as the President signed National Security Action Memorandum 263 in October of 1963. This document outlined specific plans to pull 1,000 American military advisors out of Vietnam by the end of that year, with a full withdrawal scheduled for 1965. Kennedy was moving toward détente with Nikita Khrushchev, exploring a peaceful resolution to the Cold War, and planning to end the atmospheric nuclear testing that fueled a multi-billion-dollar defense economy. All of these powerful domestic factions had an immediate, pressing motive. All of them possessed the sophisticated logistical means, the weapon systems, and the trained personnel to execute a professional wetwork operation. For over half a century, the public debate has raged like a pendulum swinging back and forth between Langley and Havana, between the mob bosses of Chicago and the wealthy oil barons of Dallas who viewed Kennedy as a socialist traitor. It is a comfortable debate, in a way. It keeps the conflict entirely domestic. It keeps the dark secret within the American family. But what if the lens we have been using is simply too narrow? What if these standard, familiar suspects were merely the local hands, the regional subcontractors, while the strategic mind behind the operation was watching the events unfold from an entirely different, distant shore? Chapter 4: The Unseen Friction. Let us widen our circle of view beyond the borders of the United States. Let us travel back to the early days of 1961, away from the humidity of Washington and deep into the dry, burning sands of the Negev Desert. John F. Kennedy was an American president who believed in absolute diplomatic balance in international affairs. He envisioned a Middle East where the United States acted as an honest, objective broker, maintaining productive, respectful relationships with both rising Arab nationalist leaders, like Egypt's charismatic President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and the young state of Israel. Kennedy believed that by supporting Nasser's economic development, he could prevent the Soviet Union from gaining a permanent foothold in the Mediterranean. But this specific vision of diplomatic balance ran directly into a wall of fierce, uncompromising regional ambition. David Ben-Gurion, the founding father and prime minister of Israel, saw his nation's survival as an absolute, sacred law, one that superseded any global diplomacy, any United Nations resolution, or any American partnership. And at the exact center of his survival strategy was a secret. a project hidden deep beneath the sands of a heavily fortified place called Dimona. Ben-Gurion wanted the atomic bomb. He believed with absolute, unshakable conviction that only nuclear deterrence could guarantee the permanent existence of his state against surrounding adversaries. He felt that the memory of recent history demanded that his people never rely on the promises of foreign powers for their protection. Kennedy, however, looked at a nuclearized Middle East and saw the inevitable spark of World War III. He had just stared directly into the abyss of total annihilation with the Soviets during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he knew, with a terrifying clarity, what happens when nuclear weapons become regional chess pieces. Kennedy was deeply committed to a global non-proliferation treaty. He believed that if Israel developed the bomb, a devastating nuclear arms race would instantly ignite across the globe, drawing the superpowers into a catastrophic confrontation. A quiet, bitter war of words began between the White House and the Israeli Prime Minister's office. It was a diplomatic confrontation so intense, so deeply classified, that standard history books and high school curricula rarely mention it to this day. Kennedy was completely resolute. The spread of nuclear weapons had to stop, and there would be no exceptions. Not even for the closest of allies. Chapter 5: The Ultimatum. By the spring of 1963, the official, highly classified letters passing between President Kennedy and Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion had ceased to carry any semblance of diplomatic warmth. They had turned cold, critical, and entirely unforgiving. Kennedy demanded that American scientists and nuclear inspectors be given total, unhindered, and regular access to the Dimona complex. He did not want token tours. He wanted to know exactly what was being processed in that desert reactor, and he wanted verified, scientific proof that the facility was not being used to develop weaponized plutonium. In his final, urgent letters that summer, dated May and June of 1963, Kennedy used political language that was completely unprecedented for an American president addressing an allied head of state. He stated in no uncertain terms that if Israel did not comply with these strict inspection demands, the United States' commitment to Israel's security and its broader international support could be fundamentally, permanently altered. The phrasing was a thinly veiled threat to withdraw American diplomatic cover at the UN and halt the vital flow of economic and military aid. To David Ben-Gurion, this was not just a political disagreement over foreign policy or regional stability. It was an existential threat to his entire life's work and the survival of his nation. To him, Kennedy was a young, naive, and dangerously idealistic leader who simply did not understand the brutal realities of the Middle East and was actively endangering the very future of the Jewish people. The pressure from Washington became so intense, so unrelenting in its daily delivery, that on June 16, 1963, Ben-Gurion abruptly resigned from his post as Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. Officially, the public was told it was due to internal political friction, exhaustion, and domestic disputes. But those within the tight inner circles of international intelligence knew the real story. The pressure from the Kennedy White House had become completely unbearable, forcing a historic political rupture. But Ben-Gurion's sudden departure from the official stage did not eliminate the deep-seated philosophy he had left behind. The intelligence apparatus he had meticulously built and nurtured, the network known as the Mossad, led by legendary directors like Issa Horel and Mir Amit, remained fully intact, fiercely loyal, and deeply embedded in the state's survival apparatus. And their absolute dedication to completing the Demona project, by whatever means necessary, never wavered for a single day. Chapter 6: The Nexus of Shadows. An operation of this massive magnitude, targeted at the head of state of the world's greatest superpower, cannot be executed by an outsider alone. If you want to change the course of history in a foreign land, you do not send your own operational agents with foreign accents or recognizable faces into a crowded American plaza. You use the infrastructure that already exists on the ground. You leverage the domestic grievances of local players. This is where the hidden paths cross in the shadows. This is where the old domestic theories and the newly uncovered international facts begin to blur into a single, chilling, coherent picture. In the early 1960s, the Mossad was not the massive, globally recognized entity we know today. It was small, elite, fiercely protective, and incredibly brilliant at forging quiet alliances where operational interests aligned. And in the summer of 1963, their strategic interests aligned perfectly with two powerful American factions who already deeply hated John F. Kennedy, rogue elements within the CIA's Covert Operations Directorate and the leadership of the American Organized Crime Syndicate. There was a vital, historic bridge between these seemingly disparate worlds. A man named Meyer Lansky. Lansky was the undisputed financial mastermind of the American Mafia, the man who built the modern gambling empires from Havana to Las Vegas, laundering billions of dollars through complex offshore accounts and Swiss banking systems. But Lansky was also a passionate, fierce Zionist supporter of the Israeli state. He had managed massive, clandestine financial networks that helped fund and illegally arm the Jewish underground forces during the 1948 War of Independence, utilizing his mafia control of the New York docks to ship weapons out under the nose of federal authorities. Lansky moved seamlessly between the criminal underworld, legitimate corporate boardrooms, and international intelligence agencies. He was the ultimate facilitator, a man whose financial genius kept him untouchable. Through him, the line between organized crime, deep state intelligence, and foreign survival disappeared completely, creating a nexus of shadows that pointed directly toward Dallas. Chapter 7: The Money Trail and the Publisher. As the decades have passed, documents once locked tightly away in dusty government archives have slowly made their way into the public record through successive declassification acts. We now know about corporate entities and international financial networks that the Warren Commission intentionally chose to ignore or completely bury. Entities like Permindex. Permindex was a Swiss-based corporate entity that on the surface dealt in international trade, real estate, and industrial development. But when European investigators, Italian police, and investigative journalists began digging into its complex corporate finances in the late 1960s, they found a completely different, darker story. Permindex was an international funding conduit, a highly secure channel through which immense amounts of capital moved silently across borders to finance right-wing paramilitary groups, including the French OAS, which attempted to assassinate President Charles de Gaulle because he chose to grant independence to Algeria. Who actually funded Permindex? A significant portion of its corporate capital traced directly back to banking interests tied to the Meyer Lansky syndicate, specific Swiss financial institutions, and, crucially, to early intelligence networks in Tel Aviv through figures like Tibor Rosenbaum, a Swiss banker who served as a primary financial operative for the Israeli state's covert arms purchases. One of the board members of this shadowy company was Clay Shaw, the prominent New Orleans businessman whom District Attorney Jim Garrison eventually put on trial in 1967 for conspiring to assassinate President Kennedy. At the time, Garrison was heavily mocked and systematically dismantled by the mainstream American media. They painted him as a frantic conspiracy theorist, a man chasing ghosts in the Louisiana bayou for personal political gain. But history and declassified documents show Garrison was looking at the exact right map. He simply did not possess the cryptographic key to read the foreign names written at the very top of the organizational chart. He saw the local CIA connections, he saw the anti-Castro radicals, he saw David Ferry, but he did not see the international financial pipeline that tied them all together. It was a pipeline fueled by a desperate, existential need to remove a president who threatened a nation's nuclear destiny and an intelligence agency's autonomy. Chapter 8. The Silencer. There is one specific, tragicomic figure in the Dallas drama who has always defied simple, logical explanation within the framework of the official lone wolf theory. Jack Ruby. The official story tells us he was just a grieving, highly emotional nightclub owner who loved the Kennedy family, a man who wanted to save the young widow Jacqueline Kennedy the deep trauma of returning to Dallas for a lengthy, public trial. So, he allegedly took his snub-nosed Colt Cobra revolver, walked down a secure ramp into a heavily guarded police garage, and shot Lee Harvey Oswald in cold blood on live television. It is a fairy tale so fragile it falls apart under the slightest logical touch. Jack Ruby was not an emotional bystander. He was a professional underworld fixer, a man who functioned as a bridge between the criminal element and the local state apparatus. He was a low to mid-level operator for the Chicago mob, sent down to Dallas years prior by figures like absolute mob boss Sam Giancana to run nightlife operations, manage prostitution rings, and keep the local police department properly corrupted through free drinks, cash envelopes, and gambling debts. But Ruby also possessed other, much deeper, historical loyalties. Declassified federal files and independent investigations have since revealed that throughout the late 1940s, Ruby had been actively involved in high-level, illegal weapons smuggling networks. He wasn't just moving guns to Latin America. He was working within the specific network managed by LA mob figure Mickey Cohen, which smuggled surplus military hardware, radar equipment, and aircraft parts directly to the Haganah, the underground military force in Palestine. Jack Ruby was a man who ultimately took his life and death orders from the Meyer Lansky network. When Lee Harvey Oswald miraculously survived the shooting at Dealey Plaza, when Oswald became an immediate liability who could open his mouth and talk to federal investigators about his intelligence handlers, the system required an immediate, permanent silencer. They needed someone who could walk past Dallas police guards with total, unhindered impunity. Jack Ruby did not act out of grief or love for Jackie Kennedy. He acted out of absolute obligation and terror. He was a soldier fulfilling a terminal contract for the only entities he feared more than death itself, ensuring the secret stayed buried in the concrete floor of the Dallas police basement. Chapter 9. The Aftermath of Silence. Let the immense weight of that November afternoon settle quietly into your mind as the narrative moves forward. John F. Kennedy was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, the eternal flame lit above his final resting place, cementing him as a tragic icon of unfulfilled promise. His younger brother, Robert, would carry the deep grief and the burning, private suspicion for 5 more years. He quietly gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and prepared for the day he would reach the White House himself to reopen the investigation into his brother's murder. But before he could achieve that goal, in June of 1968, he too was silenced by a lone gunman in a hotel kitchen. Sirhan Sirhan, a young Palestinian immigrant whose background, instant amnesia, and strange, hypnotic state left more questions than answers. And what became of the historic, high-stakes policies that had caused such deep, hidden fractures in the summer of 1963? Lyndon Baines Johnson assumed the presidency in the cramped cabinet room of Air Force One, surrounded by the blood-stained suit of the widow. Almost immediately, the political tone concerning the Middle East changed completely. The intense, aggressive diplomatic pressure on the Dimona nuclear facility simply evaporated overnight. The demanding, confrontational letters from the White House completely ceased. American inspectors were still occasionally sent to the desert facility to maintain the public illusion of non-proliferation, but they were subjected to heavily restricted, prearranged, and carefully managed visits. They were shown false walls and dummy rooms that ensured they would never see the underground plutonic separation plants hidden beneath the sand. The issue was officially dead, buried beneath the bureaucratic paperwork of the new Johnson administration. By 1967, Israel possessed its fully operational nuclear deterrent, completely secure in its military supremacy. The balance of power in the Middle East shifted permanently, and the United States smoothly transitioned from an objective, balanced broker into an unconditional, permanent diplomatic and military ally. The specific entity that Kennedy had threatened to tear into 1,000 pieces, the rogue intelligence apparatus, grew stronger, more insulated, and more deeply intertwined with foreign partners than ever before, operating above the law and outside the scrutiny of the American voter. Chapter 10. The Unbroken Thread. The night is quiet now. The shadows in the room are completely still, dancing softly against the walls as the mind relaxes. When we ask the ultimate question, the question that has haunted generations, who killed Kennedy, we are often looking for a single, definitive face. We want a distinct villain we can easily name, a clear monster we can lock away forever in the clean, safe pages of a history textbook to reassure ourselves that justice exists. But real power, real history, rarely works that way. The assassination of the 35th President of the United States was not just an isolated plot by a rogue domestic agency, or a simple hit by a vengeful mafia network, or a defensive mechanism by a foreign state. It was all of them combined in a rare moment of geopolitical symbiosis. It was a perfect, rare alignment of mutual interests. A singular moment in time where the goals of the American military-industrial complex, the finances of the international underworld, and the architects of a foreign nuclear program met at a single, precise coordinate on a map. Elm Street, Dealey Plaza, Dallas, Texas. They used domestic American intelligence assets to plan the logistics and clear the security paths. They used American mobsters to execute the cover-up, manage the shooters, and silence the patsy. But the ultimate guiding motive, the intense, existential pressure that made the murder of an American president a matter of absolute national survival, originated far from the shores of the Potomac River, in the desperate calculations of a state fighting for its nuclear birthright. As you drift off into a deep, peaceful sleep, remember that the past is never truly dead. It is not even past. It continues to breathe through the very systems, foreign policies, and institutions we live under today. The truth is never completely lost. It is simply waiting in the quiet, dark spaces, resting patiently between the lines of the official stories, softly whispering its secrets to anyone who is finally willing to listen. Sleep well. The world is vast. The secrets are deep, and the truth always remains.